Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about the evolving relationship with the General Counsel and the Board of Directors. And joining me is David Yawman, who's the former EVP, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary for PepsiCo, and also a Senior Advisor with Barker Gilmore. Welcome, Dave.
Hi, TK. Great to be with you.
It's challenging enough for the chief legal officer and or the corporate secretary to adapt to the new institutional investor world where they've learned to push their weight around and are in the mode of voting against directors if they don't like what's happening. That's one thing that sort of GCs have had to adapt to. But more importantly, when you look at what's happened in the last 3 years, where you have the worldwide pandemic, you've got a remote workforce, you've got the concentrated push on ESG, plus several social justice issues that are coming up. So when you look at the last 3 years, how has the role and the relationship of the GC with the board changed with all these factors being presented in the last, couple of years?
Yeah, great question, and a true statement of what's going on inside companies. Especially for sitting GCs, is just kind of this explosion and expansion of issues that they're forced to deal with, and certainly the board and senior management are dealing with these issues, and the GCs right in the middle of them as well. On all those issues, TK, I view it as more of an acceleration, or I don't know if it's an arrival, but it's an evolution of what has been, from my perspective, a trend, over the last 10 plus years, where the GCs have become more and more involved in a wider range of issues, probably in light of the fact of how the global marketplace has expanded, it's accelerated, the information flow has accelerated. And so I go back in time and I think of that lawyer as that legal overseer, and expanded into risk monitoring and assessment, which ultimately expanded into compliance and ethics and public policy and environmental impact, societal impact, internal culture and employee relations issues, unionization issues. All those issues sit at kind of this cross section of society, business, public policy, law, etc. And what you saw with the pandemic, what you're seeing with the social justice issues, and certainly the ESG topic, is just this culmination of, I think, what has been a trend, where more and more of these multifaceted, multidimensional issues, the GC is being pulled into by necessity. And I think that relationship, as the board deals with those issues, the relationship between the GC and the board also evolves, expands, as the board looks to the general counsel, really is a bit of the conscience of the company, or at least one of the members of management that has the broad perspective, obviously bolstered or at least foundationally in the law and public policy, et cetera, but with a view and a perspective that is as broad as the issues that the board and the company are now dealing with, which are the very topics that that you referenced. And I'd also say, I don't think this trend's going away. Obviously, ESG is here to stay. Social justice is here to stay. And you get issues even like Russia and Ukraine, which are just another significant example of kind of these very complex, issues that companies have to deal with, and ultimately GCs have to keep pace and expand their perspective and voice on those issues as well.
So let me ask a follow-up to that, because one of the things that is so, frightening to me, knowing that when I served on a board, we didn't have to deal with this, is the speed of information. Okay. And when I say that, if something happened at the company when I served on a board, we probably at least had the evening or the day to sort it out and come up with a position that we were going to take when the new day started. Okay. Because, you had newspapers and radio and there wasn't the form of instant information like there is today. But today, if you're on a flight, you can land and all hell has broken loose. So I would have to believe that the communication and the decisions that have to be made almost split second, has to have had an impact on the GC and the communication with both the CEO and the board at this point in a big way.
Yeah, that's a hugely perceptive perspective, TK. And I'd say it emphasizes actually the role of the general counsel in some fashion, because more than even ever before, you need kind of the infrastructure of governance and systems, escalation protocols, ways of essentially dealing with issues that, to your point, come up in a moment's time and become global, if not massively impactful on a company's either reputation or operations in an instant. And no matter where it happens in the world, it can ultimately create a contagious impact in different markets. And so the need to build a system and to build governance and to build essentially, what I call the infrastructure of kind of plumbing and electricity or fire alarms and sprinkler systems may be the better analogy, to deal with issues no matter where they come from, so that it's not chaotic every time one of these things pops up, because they pop up almost every day. But that you're able to systemically kind of deal with them in some form of organized way, where you get the right people in the right position to make a call very quickly, to deal with issues no matter where they arise, and ultimately to alert those that need to be involved and get their perspective and voice in the game. And I just know from my experience at PepsiCo, we operated in more than 200 countries all around the globe. At different points in time, different issues would pop up. And these days, to your point about the information flow and the speed of it, if something happens in India and the company says something or does something in India, people know about it in Brazil or Mexico or the UK instantaneously. And so the company's got to operate consistent with its values, consistent with just a routine and a methodology of operation, bolstered by its values, et cetera, on how to deal with these things and how to operate and show up in every one of the markets around the world. But that pace of information flow is a huge burden these days. It just has to be, accepted and recognized.
Well, it is sad sometimes, because it's sort of fairly easy to tell who was organized and had systems in place to deal with emergencies and who isn't. Again, it's not hard to sort of see who's prepared. So one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you and have you on the show is the research report that Corporate Board Member, which is a company that I co-founded a long time ago, and Barker Gilmore published a research report, and it was titled "Leveraging the GC: How the Right General Counsel Can Enhance Board Oversight." And there was a lot of good questions in there, but one of the ones that I wanted to, and this is sort of a two-part question. The first I wanted to ask you about is, in this survey, they asked if the board should be involved in hiring a new GC. And it was interesting that a majority of the board members said yes. Okay. So I'm going to ask you for your thoughts on that. But while that is a part two for this question, from my experience, there wasn't a great understanding, okay, from the board and sometimes even the CEO, and I'd put myself in that category, about the true responsibility that the GC had to the corporation and the shareholders of the corporation. So, and my suspicion is there's still probably, even today, a portion of board members who don't understand that the GC in the end, really, even though they report to the CEO and to the board, in the end, they have the responsibility to the corporation. So first of all, talk about that question of whether the board should be involved in the hiring. And then I'd be curious to hear your experiences or your comments related to the when push comes to shove, what the general counsel's duties are to the corporation.
Sure. Well, relative to the board being involved in the hiring, I'm a believer that absolutely the board should be involved in the hiring of the GC. I think that relationship's too important. I think the issues that will pop up maybe not on the best days, but on the toughest days with the sticky issues, that relationship between board and GC is so critical that I think it helps ultimately for the board to be involved, and appropriate for the board to be involved, perhaps not the full board, but obviously a representative number of directors being involved, or at least interviewing the final couple of candidates for the GC role, and ultimately having some form of say or a veto or some kind of influence on whether a particular individual is hired as GC. I also think there's a flip side of that it's actually in the GCs, incoming GCs or candidate for the role. I think it's in his or her interest to also have the board involved in that hiring process, because I think it's at that moment where, maybe getting a little bit into your second question, the GC, the incoming GC, who's fully aware of his or her responsibilities to the corporation and the shareholders, and in the case of a conflict between management and the company, the GC may be in a perilous spot, but should be clear about where his or her professional duties lie, and that's to the company. But I think the incoming GC's got a real good interest in talking that issue through with some of the board members in advance of the GC either being offered the job or ultimately accepting the job. Because I think to your point of your second question, I think it's important for everybody involved, from the CEO to the board and certainly the GC, to be clear about where those duties lie. And unless it's an explicit conversation with some explicit discussion around that very topic, before that issue has to really be fleshed out in the kind of the pace of a particular issue, it helps to have that explicit discussion up front. Perhaps most beneficial just to be clear with the CEO. And obviously the more broad thinking CEOs, I think, grasp that concept and understand it and accept it, but it's hard to deal with, because on a day-to-day basis, the GC is part of the management team and spends most of his or her time just dealing with the business issues of the day and being a member of the management team. And only at the most difficult moments will the GC have to essentially highlight that his or her role is really to the corporation, which is ultimately the board representing the shareholders. And so the board is really, from a formal perspective, the GC's true boss in many ways.
Well, it's, all through my career, I thought there were two positions that I never wanted to hold. One was the GC and the other was the CFO. I thought that those are the two toughest jobs in the world, because their feet are moving a million miles an hour. They had to keep this good, face on, and yet they wanted to make sure that they were doing everything before they reported to the CEO. So my hat's off to your illustrious career. And I appreciate you taking the time to join us and sort of look at the landscape of the GC and board relationship. So thanks for your time, Dave.
Yeah, thank you, TK. Thanks for doing what you're doing. Good stuff.
So that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.